My name is Julia Payton-Jones and I'm director of the Serpentine Gallery, and it is an enormous privilege to have you all here on a very, very auspicious occasion. Welcome to the Serpentine Gallery Pavilion 2006, designed by Rem Koolhaas and Cecil Balmond with Arup, and sponsored by Bloomberg, with integrated design by Arup and also our advisor Stanhope. And tonight for the Serpentine Gallery Marathon London, conceived by Ulrich Obrist and Rem Koolhaas. Central to the pavilion this year has been the public programs conceived by Ulrich and Rem for this year's pavilion. Rem has described the pavilion as a space that is defined by activities and events, a space that facilitates the inclusion of individuals in communal dialogue and shared experience. And this is as important to him as the structure itself. Rem and Ulrich have a long and illustrious history of collaborations, beginning with Cities on the Move in 1998 at the Hayward Gallery, and since then they have continued to work on numerous interview projects and in other ways over many years. It is truly a privilege for the Serpentine Gallery to be hosting this marathon, which brings together such a distinguished group of speakers to focus on this city. The event is being recorded in many forms, on film, audio, text, and in due course a book. However, this does not replace the experience of being present, really seeing a time capsule unfold in the most remarkable way. And so it's my privilege and pleasure to say to Rem and Ulrich, thank you very much for initiating this extraordinary project and to undertaking the following 24 hours. This year's programme is presented in collaboration with Time Out, and thanks to the team at Time Out, in particular Tony Elliott, founder of the magazine, who's worked with the Serpentine for 20 years, John Luck, the marketing director, and Sandy Tozer. The Park Nights programme is supported by the Arts Council of England, the Netherlands Architecture Fund, and Pilsner Urquell, with very important monies from Arts Council England to, as I've said, to support this initiative. We're delighted to be working once again with Resonance FM, who are broadcasting the event live, so for those of you who leave the pavilion, and I hope you'll all stay, you'll be able to tune in to the next 24 hours. And finally, my indebted thanks to Sally Tallant, Head of Education and Public Programmes, and her remarkable marathon team, as well as to the Serpentine staff as a whole. So now we kick off.
Okay. Thank you very much, Julia. As Douglas Gordon would say, and obviously we can't start a marathon of 24 hours without talking about Douglas Gordon and his 24-hour film. As Douglas Gordon would say, it has only just begun. Many thanks to Brian Eno, and as Julia said, many thanks to the extraordinary teams of the Serpentine, also the marathon organizers and all the interns having worked on this project. Actually, it is not the first time Rem and I record conversations with Brian, and I think Rem wanted to make the beginning.
Brian, we've known each other maybe about 20 years. And maybe the largest mystery that I have in all these years is how somebody with such extravagant experiences can be so consistently thoughtful. Thoughtful, yes. And in a way, I would like to ask you to comment on your own character as stretching from the most Baroque to the most minimalistic, without apparent pain or contradiction.
When I was at school, I had a very bad science teacher and a very good art teacher. So because of that, I think I became an artist. But when I left school, I realized that actually it was the sciences that interested me as much as anything else. And so I think I spent a lot of time somehow trying to exercise thoughts that came from science in art, somehow or other. And so I got very interested in systems and cybernetics and in creating conceptual machines of different types to make music for me. And I think That, of course, meant that I carried on with my interest in science as well as my interest in art. So they didn't seem difficult to integrate to me. They always were integrated. The other thing, I suppose, is that I studied as a painter and became a musician. And when I became a musician, I started making music that gradually became more and more like painting, in that it was steady state, non-narrative. It wasn't like music normally is structured. It didn't have a teleological quality to it. Then I moved back also into making visual art of some kind, but I made that more and more like music. So again, I felt these things mapped onto each other very easily. It didn't seem a stretch to make them seem like one activity.
Maybe it could be interesting to know a little bit more about this art school which you visited, because in many actually conversations we kind of have brought up this sort of necessity for new kind of experimental schools, and it's obviously interesting to kind of memorize or remember particularly interesting experimental moments. I mean, there have been so many discussions about necessities for kind of new Black Mountain College, and when we spoke last time, the sort of way you described the Ipswich School of Art and that sort of whole course run by Roy Escott, it sounded like a very, very interesting moment, so it would be great to hear a little bit more what was so special about this school.
It was a very unusual school. In a way, it was very much a product of the 60s, but also it was the product of another person who was as interested in the sciences as in the arts, which was Roy Ascott. Ascott had become interested in behavioral psychology and also in cybernetics. And so the staff at the school included painters, composers, cyberneticians, mathematicians, gallerists, which was very unusual then. There was a guy who ran a gallery in London who used to come in to talk about the business of art, which I don't think was happening at any other art college at the time. It wasn't sort of admitted that there was a business involved. And the art school that I was at, the first one that I was at, actually only really existed in that form for 2 years and was then closed down by the education committee because it didn't produce many painters. Produced people doing all sorts of other things, but not many of them were doing painting. So the college had, I think, a very interesting and unusual staff, and we all turned up at the age of 16, I guess, 16 or 17, with little boxes of paints, which we were immediately told to put away because we wouldn't be needing those for a long time. And then the staff proceeded to do things like lock us in cupboards or shout at us or make us paint 160-foot-long pictures on newsprint or all sorts of odd experiments, but not without logic, in fact. So I had a very good time there. It was a complete liberation for me.
Because I'm like you, a child of that kind of education, whether I want to or not, and I feel very uncomfortable about the kind of wholehearted embrace of painting or architecture now by later generations.
Yes.
What is your kind of relationship with or mood or attitude to, for instance, Brit art?
Yeah. Well, it sounds very condescending to say it, but I just feel I've seen so much of it before. The sort of half-hearted conceptualism of so much of what I see around, I think we had a more full-blooded version of it. You know, conceptualism was very much a movement of the 60s, of the late 60s, and I think we did it very well, in fact. It wasn't, there was no commercial aspect to it then. It wasn't well recognized, and people didn't realize that you could sell photographs of it to make a living. They just did it and lost money on it in general. But I see this, a lot of the contemporary forms of conceptualism as being very heavy-footed, leaden, non-humorous, and also non-profound as well.
You and I have talked about architecture, and you strike me as somebody with a kind of fundamentally critical attitude on architecture and its inherent authoritarianism. You used to be optimistic about certain figures and their impact. Christopher Alexander, one of them. I have two questions. We live now in an apparent apotheosis of architecture, of the architectural, not of your kind of architecture, but presumably of the more authoritarian architecture. And are you still optimistic about the potential for those more critical voices on the one hand? And the other question is about the city. More than ever before, people live in cities, talk about cities, and seem to embrace the monster and the beast that is the city. What is your relationship with this city at this moment?
Well, to answer the second question first, I also embrace the monster, and I like doing so. I like living in a city, and indeed I like a lot of the structures of cities. I suppose the ways in which I've been critical of architecture is when I felt that they contributed neither to the external experience of the city or to the internal experience. I mean, a lot of this criticism, I think, came from living in New York during a certain period in the late 70s and early 80s, where I saw quite a lot of exercise of architecture that seemed to me simply glamorous, actually. It was architecturally, structurally, it was totally uninteresting. I'm thinking, for example, of, was it the Philip Johnson's AT&T building? I think that was AT&T, that big pink building. Yes, that's right, with those sort of scallops on it. Which everybody said was such an amazing building. But actually it was an amazing choice of marble or whatever it was. But inside it was exactly like any other building I'd seen. So there were no innovations in the place where I thought architects might be making interesting innovations. The innovation was entirely to do with the cladding of the building. And after all, it wasn't that innovative either, even in that respect. And I saw a lot of that kind of architecture at the time. Though I saw architecture that I very much enjoyed, for instance, the downtown, the Renzo Piano downtown near the World Trade Center. The building that the windows get bigger as it goes higher. Do you know that one? It starts with small square windows at the bottom and they become larger and larger. So the top of the building is virtually all glass. So it sort of fades off into the sky. That's a very attractive idea. As regards Christopher Alexander, well, I very unfashionably am still a believer in him as a theorist, though I'm not very interested in his architecture. But I still do like the idea of a kind of evolution of building techniques rather than a series of revolutions.
Hans?
There's many other things I think which could be interesting to discuss in relation to the city. We have lots of questions also for you about London, but before that, maybe it could be interesting to talk a little bit more about the sonic city, and I was somehow wondering to which extent somehow the sort of idea of sounds of the city enters your work, but then on the other hand also to which extent sonic interventions in the city kind of play a role right now for you.
It's quite hard to intervene in a city because you generally have to be louder than it. And generally you don't want to add noise. So it's difficult to make an intervention in a place that is already noisy. What you can do is choose a place that is already sort of quiet and encourage people to be even quieter there. And this is what I've tended to do in terms of interventions like this. But I can't see really any point in making a musical installation as I've been invited to, for example, on Piccadilly Circus. I think it would just raise the general noise level, the way that in restaurants people put music on, so everybody has to talk louder, so then they turn the music up and everybody talks louder still. So I don't want to be part of a feedback cycle like that. In terms of living in the city, I think that if you're a composer, your sonic surrounding is the context against which you generally rebel. For instance, I made my quietest records when I lived in a very noisy apartment in New York. I lived on the corner of Broome and Broadway, and this was a street where the huge trucks on their way to the Holland Tunnel would come by and the whole building would rock. And that was where I made very quiet music, because that was the place that I wanted to be so desperately. When I lived in the country in Suffolk, I made my loudest records. So I think I always make the place I would rather be in.
And in terms of interventions in a more quiet way in the city, is maybe your recent project in Beijing, is that an example for that? Or
Yeah.
Can you maybe tell us about that?
That was a very successful project. I was asked to do a piece of music in one of the parks in Beijing, and I chose this park called Rattan Park, which has a circular wall. So there's a central area which is closed off by a wall. The wall's about 3 meters high, and I suppose the diameter of this space is maybe 150, 180 meters. And I made a piece using, this is, by the way, a place where people go to sit and be quiet, and is particularly known as a place where old men fly kites. And there are always at least half a dozen old guys in there flying kites. And the place is very, very quiet anyway. Nobody makes a lot of noise in there. So I started off by making a piece really for these old guys, thinking what would they like to hear, plus what would they be able to stand listening to for a month, because the installation was due to be on for a month. So you have to think of the people who are going to be there every day. And I made a piece that was similar to a piece I did here in the Science Museum, where I had 16 CD players around the edges of this circle, and each one had the sound of one bell on it, and each bell would ring every so often. And the cycles were not synchronized, so sometimes you've got clusters of many bells ringing and sometimes individual ones. And I treated the sound in such a way that it sounded as though these things were coming from a very long way away, even when you were quite close to them. And well, it was a success in that the kite flyers really loved it, and more kite flyers started to appear there. And they gave very good comments to the park and said, could the piece be kept there? Which it wasn't, in fact. But
I want to maybe end about one particular issue that you have been kind of very early optimist about the power of the digital. And I think of the promise of the digital as relieving our lives of a lot of substance and a lot of things and a lot of burdens. And if you look now with kind of perhaps 20 years experience to that promise, do you still maintain that promise?
yeah, I still maintain it, but I also see that it's a very, very tilted playing field. You know, the promise of digital when it first appeared was suddenly everything is possible, or suddenly so many things are possible that were never possible before. But of course, although everything is possible, some things are a lot easier than others, and those are the ones that you keep doing. So the playing field is very much tilted against certain kinds of activities. For example, in music, it's very much tilted against the use of the 3 million years of evolution that went into our muscles and our fine muscle control. Digital, it inclines you to use that muscle, the one in that finger, or those two as well, if you've got one of those complicated mouse. What it doesn't incline you to do is to use all the rest of your musculature. And that turns out to be quite an important part of how music is made. So, of course, you can make perfectly nice music like that, using that finger, and a lot of us do. But it's much harder to do something that now reintegrates your physical body into the form, and you tend not to do it. So the playing field is tilted against that, and that's an interface problem which I think people are starting to solve. You know, the fact is that we have very, very, very simplistic interfaces at the moment. We have this very complicated creature here, and that very complicated object called the computer, and this ridiculously small bottleneck through which you have to communicate with each other. So I think this is the next interesting part of the digital revolution.
Maybe,
Yeah.
I don't know, we have time for one more. If you have time for one more question, I wanted to ask you really about the current moment. I think it would be really interesting if you could tell us a little bit about how you see this current moment in the world, and also in terms of your work and what is sort of next.
And unrealized projects you might throw in as a...
Sometimes I think things are so desperately precarious at the moment that everything else we're doing is utterly irrelevant. Like sitting here talking or going to my studio making whatever I make seems increasingly off the point to me. I've always been an optimist until recently, and I've become very pessimistic recently. You know, this the Lebanon thing is only a simple example of how suddenly it seems that a lot of states are conspiring to have a war because they all think they're going to come out of it best. And it's not a little war that they want to have a big war. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying Israel, America, us, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, they all see a good reason for a nice big regional conflict. And I don't really see anybody has a strong enough interest in preventing them from doing it at the moment. So that's one type of crisis. The other type of crisis is the really big question, which is about climate change. This, for instance, is the hottest July since 1659 in England. 10 of the last 14 years have been the hottest 10 years on record. So this seems to me a really difficult problem as well, in that even if we suddenly all decide tomorrow that we're going to do everything right, it's a 50-year ship that's got to turn. You know, it's going in a direction. It's going to be a long time before that direction changes. So I'm kind of pessimistic, and I'm looking to my daughter's generation to just burn the lot of us and start again, really.
Maybe to come from the pessimistic assessment to, towards the end of the interview, to a kind of maybe optimistic moment. I was somehow wondering about your dreams. If you had any kind of dreams or kind of unrealized projects you'd like to see realized?
You asked me that last time.
I know,
met you.
but it's been a long time ago. It's been 6 years ago, so maybe
no, I know, but
wonder.
the embarrassing thing is that I think they're still the same ones.
Can you still tell us?
The unrealized projects are still unrealized. I've been developing this idea of something called generative music, which is self-creating music. And I think I've done that quite successfully, but now I want to start to do it at the atomic or molecular level. I want to start at a much deeper level in the music of making it generative. This is kind of hard to explain, but it's as if I've found out how to make, let's say, motor cars assemble themselves, but now I want to find out how to make molecules assemble themselves. That's the sort of the only analogy I can make, really.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Do you know,